Hi everyone. In this video we're going to be looking at some of the basic concepts of the HTML markup language. So it's a continuation of our previous video, and we start just with a bit of a review of the terminology. The HTML language is the notation for describing the markup of a web page. It's not a programming language, it's a markup language. The HTML elements are the instructions that are used by the developer to organize and lay out the content of a web page. And then the content, which is what the browser user sees, and the HTML elements are contained in the same file that we call a web page or an HTML document. The HTML document comprises two sections. The first section is the heading or the head section, and it can contain the title, styling instructions, and browser information. The second section, or the body section, contains the part with the information content that the users will see displayed in their web browsers. We should note that a web page could contain, could link to, well, it could contain various media. They're not part of the web page per se, but you can link them within the web page, and they can be considered part of that web page. So this is one of the main things we're going to do this semester. We're going to figure out how to link images, how to create various text formatting, colors and sounds and videos, even animations, and add some interactivity. One of the main things we're going to do this semester. The HTML elements that we mentioned are considered to be the building blocks of the language, and certain elements such as the HTML, the head and the body should always exist and must be placed in the correct order in the document. Elements have certain syntax rules that they must follow, so it's safe to say that HTML has a syntax that must be obeyed. And here is an overview of what an HTML web page could look like. So in between the two HTML tags, we enclose everything else. So we got an opening HTML tag and a closing one. The first section of our documents is going to be the head section, so we got an opening and a closing head. One of the really popular elements that we include in the heading is the title of the web page, which is what gets displayed in the tab of your web page in the browser. So the element for that one is called title. And then down here we have the body. I do believe I've got an HTML template on our website in the first week folder that you can use if you for some reason forget how to structure this. If you get stuck, and you can always look it up, or maybe even copy and paste and start from there. So this is like a skeleton, a body that you can use for your own web pages. The elements that may be placed in the heading section include the title. Again, important that you include this. Various scripts. Usually this is going to be JavaScript snippets that produce things like animation and create some basic interactivity on the client side. And the styling rules, very common. This is what CSS. We're going to get to that, and we'll start using it extensively to help us create some styling for our web pages. And then the meta tags, which is really just information that the browser uses or the search engines use, for example. The body section contains the information which is displayed, and it may include things like text, images, graphics, sound, video, interactive elements. As I mentioned earlier, these are stored in separate files. They're not in the actual web page, but there's different ways for us to link them and make them seem like they're part of the web page itself. Elements that exist help us with there are elements that can help us with creating headings, paragraphs, pre-formatted text, quotes, horizontal lines, different kinds of lists, and so on and so forth. Today we start with some of these. We're going to see the syntax for some of these, and then next week we continue with the rest of the basic elements. In this example here that you're seeing on the next slide, this is I guess a kind of a common error for beginner level programmers, if you want to, if you will. It shows that somebody tried to format a text to make it look like a poem to be displayed on the screen, but they didn't use any elements here. There's no paragraphs, there's no new lines, no formatting of the text. I don't have an actual output of this. You can try it out on your own. It's going to be a really good exercise, but this should come out in your browser as one really huge single line with no formatting, okay, because the browser ignores all the white spaces. It doesn't care for new lines that you place there by simply hitting the carriage return, the enter key. The tabs, the spaces, all of those will be ignored. If you do want them in there, there's ways for you to place them in there with the help of different elements. Also, it's important to note that different browsers do provide a bit of help with formatting text in their own way. So they do have, for example, a default font, certain type and size. I believe with Internet Explorer it was Times New Roman with a point size of 12. So that part, if you're happy with that, you can leave it like that. If not, you can customize that. Okay. HTML tag guidelines. We should note that elements are enclosed in angle brackets and that you should not have any spaces or between the element name and the angle brackets. That would cause a problem. We want to try and use an opening and a closing tag every time. This is a requirement if you're creating XHTML compliant code, but with HTML browsers are generally much more forgiving. It's just a good programming practice to make sure you got opening and closing tags, and make sure that all the element names are spelled in lowercase. The general syntax is you include the opening tag of the element. It may have some attributes that go with it. This is usually optional. They allow you to customize the way the element works. You got a closing tag, and in between those two you provide the content for which this element will be applied. Oops. The attributes, here's the syntax for the attributes. We use whatever the attribute name is, equal sign, and then in between quotation marks we specify the value for it. A quick example here, we're really jumping ahead with the image element, but that's fine. This is the element we can use to to load an image within the web page. So the way we link to an image from within the web page is with the img element. It requires the source attribute src, and then we specify where that image is, where the file is located. In this case, I'm assuming that the bird JPEG file is in the exact same folder where your web page is. If it isn't, we're not going to see any image on our as part of our web page. A very common error that beginner level programmers run into. So please be careful about if you're linking to an image or an audio or some other file, make sure that the browser can find it. If you don't provide a path leading the file name, it is assumed that this file is in the same folder where your web page is. Alt, the alternative name, or title for your image. I believe is optional, but it's always a good idea to have that in there just in case there's a problem with the image. If it doesn't load, let's say it's just not there, or the internet connection is really slow and you can't load it, the alternative text is going to get displayed. So in this case we have an explanation that we're supposed to see a photo of a bird. With the image element, we do have some additional attributes that I've listed down here. We can specify the height and the width. Interestingly enough, this browsers are going to do their best to actually fit your image this particular size. So if you specify a height and a width, even if that image doesn't have that height or width, the browsers are usually going to do their best to display that image within your specified height and width. This may cause the image to change, to get altered onto the screen and not look as expected, but the browser will do its best to display the image within that size. You can also align it. This is one of those things that you probably do better with CSS. Every time you specify the style for an element, by the end of this course you're going to think about how to do that in CSS, but browsers are still going to work with this, and it's still going to work if you use it. Some more additional examples here. You can tell this first command sets the background color using a name, pink. The second one sets the foreground color using a name again. The third one sets the color for links using a name. The fourth one sets the visited links color to, okay, now they're using a hexadecimal value for RGB, red, green, and blue. I may have a separate discussion on how this works. I certainly will, because we're going to talk about color. Today I'm just going to say this is a combination of red, green, and blue will produce the color that you desire. In this case, we have full intensity of red, FF, and complete lack of green and blue, zeros. So the visited links are going to show up in bright red. And then finally down at the bottom here, we specify a color using no red or full intensity of green and no blue. So these links are going to show up in green. Please do use lowercase for attributes as well. And I've updated the link here to show you one of the best lists of attributes. I still have that open in my browser. One of my favorite websites. Every time I got a question about a specific HTML tag or anything related to HTML or CSS, probably the best place to visit is the W3 Schools. It's a free reference website that lets you, it not only describes how things work, but they let you test things. So I got these little exercises that you can use to test your knowledge, and you get to see the answers. So this link that I've provided gives you a complete list of the current HTML attributes. You get to see which attribute belongs to which element, and some of these actually can be used in multiple different elements. I'm not going to go through the entire list today. Now some of these say they're not supported in HTML5. Keep in mind that this is really all up to the browsers. Now it's a recommendation that they get deprecated and removed from HTML. In other words, that the browsers not support them anymore. But it's really up to Microsoft, Mozilla, and Google and Apple to decide how they implement their browsers, and they may opt to still provide functionality for these attributes. Eventually they may get dropped and disappear and not work at all, or just get ignored, but it is quite possible that most of the browsers actually still support these, even though they're not supposed to be part of HTML5. They used to be used in the previous versions of HTML. There's only 3 of these. And there's some elements that this is also true for, but we're going to see those as we go along. Okay, back to my presentation. Attributes being used in structural elements such as paragraphs. Here's an example. For example, we set the style for the body to have a color to be colored in red, and this is going to hold true for the entire body of your web page. So unless in here you change the styling for a specific item on your web page, it's going to get showed up. Your text is going to get showed up in red. I do have templates on, well, at least the HTML template should be in our week 1 folder. This is a bit outdated, should probably get rid of it, but this is a perfect template that we can use for our own coding, the HTML, the heading, the title, the body. And not quite sure if whenever you don't have a particular character encoding set on your system, this is going to act more like a recommendation than a requirement. So UTF-8 corresponds to Unicode. It's a character encoding that it uses 2 bytes to encode characters, and it's 2 bytes allow you to store, what is it, more than 65,000 different characters. So it's large enough to handle the alphabets of, for example, the Greek Cyrillic alphabets, a lot of Chinese, Japanese characters, I believe. Now, whether that works perfectly in your web page, I think in part depends on whether you have this kind of character encoding on the system where you're opening up the web page. This is something we can test. But the idea here is that you're saying, okay, I want my default character encoding to be set to UTF-8. So I want to be able to display all those characters. ASCII, if you've heard of it, is also a character encoding scheme, but it only uses 1 byte. And so 1 byte is, what is that? 256 different characters. It's a lot smaller. It's got the Latin alphabet, the numbers, some control characters. Unicode is a whole lot larger. Okay, basic text formatting simply draws your attention to the fact that there are some characters that are considered special, and in order for you to display them, you've got to use escape sequences. Or in this case, in your HTML code, you're going to use a little piece of code that identifies the character. For example, if I ask you to include the copyright character at the end of your work, this would be the way to do it. You do ampersand, copy, semicolon. The browser is going to read this and say, okay, they need me to display the copyright character, and the browser will display this part with that character. And I just noticed this is an image, I can't really edit it, but I noticed the space. If you want to display a single space onto the screen, you use non-breaking space, ampersand NBSP. It's missing the semicolon at the end. Okay, that takes us to the next element we want to learn about today. P for paragraph. It's designed to allow us to create a paragraph within our web page. Okay, it's one of those chunks of text that have a trailing line, so it's separated from the rest of the text and it looks like a paragraph. If you look at the 2 statements over here and you test them in a web page, they should come out looking a bit like this. Okay, so extra spaces are ignored, but the paragraph elements are not, and they will get displayed. The new line character, this is element. This element is going to force the cursor to go on down to the next line. It will not create a new blank line. It will simply force the cursor to move down to the next line. And if you're programming in HTML rather than XHTML, then you don't really need to close that element. You just need the BR, like so. Headings. We'll probably use this on a few occasions in our exercises and assignments. There's 6 levels of headings that browsers recognize, starting with heading 1 being the largest one, going all the way down to level 6 being the smallest one. And I urge you to actually try this on your own. Heading 6 normally is it's a very, very small font. It's nearly difficult, impossible to read. So try it out and see how this works. I'm sure you'll find good use for using headings in your own web pages. Headings can be any length, and they will wrap around if they're longer than the browser window. And if you forget the closing tag, all text that follows will be part of the heading. Heading tags do make the text stay enclosed bold, and they do define the size for the text. And they will insert blank lines before and after the heading. And by default, I think they're left justified, so you can change that with the help of style attributes. You can right justify them, center justify them, whatever works for you. And there's a visual representation of the different headings. It's not drawn to scale. It's likely that this will differ in your own browsers on your own machines, but it does give you an idea of how this works. Okay, the next one, the HR, a horizontal rule, allows you to create a single horizontal bar displayed onto the screen as part of your web page. And it's one of those things that you can customize. With the help of CSS, you can change the styling of this, and how thick it is, what kind of style it follows. Is it dotted? Is it dashed? Is it just a solid big line? So these are some of the things that we'll play with and we'll customize. White space management in HTML. If you do need to display a space, the way to do that is with the escape sequence for space. BR we just established was you force the cursor to go on down to the next line. Pre is for pre-formatted text. Anything that appears, any text that appears in between those two will be displayed onto the screen exactly as it appears in between the two elements. So you're telling the browser, look, the following text should be displayed in the manner that you see it here. I don't need to worry about any other formatting, just assume that I've already formatted this text. And block quote will likely be interpreted slightly different in different browsers, but you're saying, I got a piece of quote here that I want you to display. Usually this is going to show up indented and italicized, so you're quoting something. And just a reminder from earlier, that little poem that we saw, you could use the pre element to make it display the way it's supposed to. Okay. The concept of nesting or embedding elements into one another refers to the fact that in HTML it's legal to nest elements within one another. Okay, you just have to be careful about how you do it. The requirement is that you always close the last element that you opened. So in this example here, maybe not the best example, but still it shows we are creating a heading 1 element, a bit of text, which we also want to be emphasized. Emphasis means the way browsers interpret the emphasis element may be slightly different. Most likely emphasis shows up as italicized text. The only time when it probably is going to differ in different browsers is if you, let's say, have a feature that let's say you have a problem with reading text off of the screen, and you have a tool that reads the text out loud to you. Okay, when that tool sees an emphasized text, it may pronounce it slightly differently, okay, based on what tool is and what browser it is. But normally the way EM works is you're just going to see this italicized. So back to the nesting part. So this is an example of how you can apply two different elements to the same text by nesting them one into another. And you just have to be careful about the way you order the closing and opening element tags. Block and inline elements. A little bit of terminology here. Um, Headings, paragraphs, these are considered block level elements. Inline elements usually are the ones that just sustain the flow. Block level elements begin on a new line, and some space may be added above and below the entire element by default. We'll see what the tags, or I'm sorry, what the elements are for creating such parts of code and why you would want to use them in just a moment. But let's just now understand the terminology and make sure we differentiate between the two. Um, Inline elements stay in the flow of the web page content. There's no line breaks. Inline elements do not start on new lines. Okay. For example, the emphasis element is an example of an inline element. Okay. Strong, quite like the emphasis. Really, usually the way this gets displayed in browsers is the text is going to get bolded. It will be displayed in boldface. But if you're using some kind of software tool that reads the text out loud to you, um, based on what program that is and which browser you're using, you may end up with a different way of that text being pronounced to you. Okay, that's what strong is. But visually, if you're not using any special software, browsers are really just going to show this as bold-faced text. Okay. The distinction between block level and inline elements is important. In HTML markup, whether an element is block level or inline restricts what other elements it may contain. For example, you cannot put a block level element within an inline element, such as a paragraph within a link. Block level and inline elements behave differently when it comes to applying styling, or cascading style sheets. The hyperlink element is the next thing we'll look at. Probably one of the most important elements that you'll be using this semester. It's the A element. It stands for anchor, and then it requires one attribute, href, which is a reference to where you're linking. An address over here could either be a location on the internet somewhere, or it could be just a local source file that is on your own system. So you use the same element for both, whether you're linking locally to a local file or whether you're linking to a web address somewhere. You do href, and then you provide, well, in this case, in this example here, we're providing the URL of AUBG-EDU. So you spell out the entire URL. And then the text that you see in between the two tags is really what's going to get displayed onto the screen, and it will be turned into a link to that location. Okay, so it's important to understand that. This is probably the first thing that we should test, and in one of my first exercises, I'm going to ask you to create hyperlinks. Once again, just a reminder here that you could be linking to a web address or just a local file. That's perfectly fine. And that takes us to the last couple of items we're going to be looking at in this video, the div and span elements, the division and the span elements. Okay, div allows you to create a block level element, while span allows you to create an inline element. On their own, they don't actually format the elements in any special way. There's no special styling. They really just allow you to identify the individual parts of your web page as either a block level element or an inline element, and then from there you get to apply whatever styling you want. Okay, they have no inherent presentation qualities of their own. You use them with style sheets to format the content however you like. Believe it or not, we'll actually be using these quite often in our own web pages. to format various parts of our web pages. The div element identifies a division or a section of an HTML, which is of an HTML document, just actually a block level division of text, and you can use it like a container, if you will, around a logical grouping of elements on that page. And by marking related elements as a div, such as in this example here, and giving them a descriptive name, we haven't really given a name here, but we could do that. You give context to all the elements in that group, and then later you can change the styling to that part of your web page. This is useful for not only making the structure of the documents clearer, but also for adding style and properties. It's ideal for marking different sections of the page, things like chapters, abstracts, notes, what have you. And like I said, it facilitates the application of common styling instructions to these sections. What happens here is we set the text font color to red for everything that appears in between the two div tags, which we have one heading 4 and we have one paragraph. That part of the text which is outside of that div, this is some text, is not going to get styled with red color. The span element, it says here, it offers the same benefits as the div, except that it's designed for inline elements that don't introduce line breaks. Because the span is an inline element, it can only contain text and other inline elements. In other words, you cannot put block level elements inside a span, but you can put a span inside a block. An important distinction. So here is one example of using the span element to change the foreground color of your text. And with this, we wrap up our discussion for the basics of HTML programming. We're going to pick it up here with our next video. Thank you for watching.